Good morning. So good to be with you this morning. If you have children in Vineyard Kids, we're shifting to our summer schedule soon. And so if you need questions about that and some clarity, just let me know after the service. I'll be glad to make it clear. The reality is that normally in the summer, we give the bulk of our volunteers a little bit of time off. We bring the kids in here, but we will be offering nursery for the little guys throughout the summer. And but that'll start up here soon. The shift comes because, goodness, school-age kids must be about done with school. For those of you that are from here, you may not know, but my kids watched their friends back in Atlanta finish school like 3-4 weeks ago, and it created some feels. It did. It created some. We are in our Tending Chaos series. We started last week, and we'll be through this. Basically, June and July will be in this series. And we're looking at the overwhelming reality of life and sort of our role in responding to that. How do we tend it? How do we turn to God in the midst of it? What kind of tools can we have to deal with the chaos of life? Because I know many of you, your life is easy and always goes the same way and is highly predictable and the hot water heater never breaks. Like, I know that for many of you, that's the case. So this is for the other people, and for those, if you can just kind of suffer through it for the sake of people whose lives sometimes just turns into chaos. This series is really for them, and maybe you've got a friend going through that, or maybe it's coming next week because life does that sometimes. I hope it's not. All right. We're going to start out, we're in Mark chapter 4, end of Mark chapter 4, and I kind of want to set the stage for you. So, among a bunch of Greeks and Romans, there's a village that has a crazy guy. And I don't mean your run-of-the-mill crazy guy. I mean, this guy is terrifying. He's crazy enough that there have been times when the people have decided, we need to arrest this guy and chain him up. He's dangerous to himself and to others. And he's crazy enough that he broke the chains and got loose again. Very animalistic. Very scary. And he's wild. He's wild enough that he's naked, which is weird and very awkward. And he lives kind of out in the wilds, in the hills, up by the tombs, in the caves with the dead bones. And he howls at night, and he's so animalistic, he'll pick up stones and he'll cut himself with them. And nobody wants anything to do with this guy. Nobody wants anything to do with this guy. And I'm not exactly sure how it happens. Like, I'm really curious. Did the Father go, hey, Jesus, I need you over here? Or did the Holy Spirit kind of move him? Or Jesus was like, somebody needs me. Like, I don't know exactly how it went. But Jesus is in a village doing ministry. He's healing, he's casting out demons, he's teaching. Like, he is in the middle of the very work he's called to. And for some reason, he's like, guys, we're going to go over there. Well, okay, Jesus, where are we going? I'll tell you when we get there. So they go and they get in the boats, and it's nighttime. It's not that big a deal. Half of his disciples are fishermen on that lake, right? So not a big deal. They get in the boats. And nobody knows where they're going exactly or why they're going there. Why would we go spend time with these pagans when there are these perfectly respectable Jewish people here in this village that are already doing ministry and enjoying it? Why are we going there? They don't know. They get in the boat. And the wind picks up. And the wind picks up some more. And as wind and large bodies of water do, the waves follow. And then it's dark and there's lightning and there's a storm. And it is just, the waves are like crashing into the boat, and the disciples are bailing water out with their buckets, and the waves are coming over the boat, and everybody's terrified except Jesus, who's asleep, and everybody's freaking out, especially the guys who know that lake. Because they know this is the kind of storm that kills people. And they rush back and they wake him up and they're like, Jesus, we're dying here, buddy, help us. He's like, oh my gosh, guys, come on. And he stands up and he tells the wind and waves what to do. And they do. He's like, hush, y'all, I'm sleeping here. Give a guy a minute's rest. And the wind and the waves are like, yes, sir. And they just, immediately there's this calm. And everybody on the boat, their eyes were pretty big because of the storm, and they had all of the adrenaline feels of the panic, and it only got bigger. Because now they're actually terrified. Who speaks to the wind and waves with authority, and they listen? The disciples are like, they're terrified of Jesus. They're absolutely terrified of Jesus. And the weather's gone calm, and they continue across the lake, and the sun rises, little fluffy clouds. Okay, we're going to be okay now. And they get to the shore, and that guy shows up. They get to the shore, and that guy shows up, and he's naked, and he's not clean, and he doesn't have good hygiene. His hair is, I don't know what kind of wild, and he's got all these cuts and scars and blood because he cuts himself with stones, and he lives up in the tombs with the dead bones. Not a pleasant, like that guy shows up, and the disciples are like, this is just not getting better. And Jesus says, come out of him. And then there's this dialogue that immediately starts. I know who you are, says the crazy man. I know who you are. I don't want you to destroy us. I don't want you to torture us. Would it be okay if we go over those pigs? Can we go over there? Because you're scary. Crazy demon guy is scared of Jesus. So are the demons inside him. And Jesus allows it, which I'm not sure I understand. Like, just between you and me, I'm not sure I understand this piece of the puzzle. Like, it kind of mystifies me. And the demons flee from this guy, and they go into the herd of pigs that's over here on the hillside, and they all get crazy, and they run off the cliff and fall in the water and drown. And the guy gets down at Jesus' feet in worship and says, thank you. And they find some clothes for him. I'm guessing they're wet from the storm the night before. But they find him some clothes. And they cover him up. And he sits, and there's this teaching time. And the poor swineherds that were up on the hill have no idea what's going on. Their entire herd just jumped off the cliff and fell into the water and drowned. And they have no idea how they're going to explain that to the village. They had responsibility for the welfare of those animals. I doubt the village is big enough to process that many pigs quickly. There's no refrigeration. I don't know if they own enough salt. Like, this is a disaster. And the swineherds report to the village, and the village comes out, and here's Jesus and this entourage, because he always shows up with them. He's got his disciples, and he's got the people that travel with him, and there were boats, plural. There's people. And then there's this guy, and they recognize him because like everybody knows if you see that face, run. And he is sitting on the ground, Jesus' feet, clothed. Thank you, that's actually really helpful. And in his right mind. It's clearly different. Everybody knows it's different. And they're like, could you leave? Like, he was terrifying. But Jesus, you're kind of more so. Could you leave? She's like, okay. And so they all loaded back up in the boats. And crazy demon-possessed guy who's now not demon-possessed, who we don't know his real name, but his mama did. She's like, can I come with you? And she's like, why don't you hang out and tell people what God did for you? He's like, okay, I can do that. And he goes telling people what Jesus did for him. Like, hey guys, let me tell you about this. I had a legion of demons. I don't anymore. Remember that time I broke those chains? I can't anymore because now I'm whole. And he goes and he's telling everybody. And Jesus and the guys, they get back in the boat, and they have just a beautiful day on the lake. It's a lovely day, and they go across, and they go back to the same village they left, and they pick up the same ministry he was doing. And every time I see this passage, I'm like, I think maybe Jesus crossed that lake just for him.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Wow. He doesn't do other ministry. I'm pretty sure the storm was just like in the way of what he was trying to do, and it was like an aside, which still blows my mind of how much power do you have to have that that's like your byproduct. But he like interrupted the whole ministry flow, took the team, goes over, sets this guy free. And that guy's life was entirely chaos. It was chaos for him. It was chaos anywhere he went. And Jesus just rode in and just absolutely rode that chaos to submission. And sets him free. And it's such this gift of compassion that this guy that's way outside of who we would expect Jesus to go to, this guy who's way outside of what anybody wants to spend time with, Jesus just does this extra little trip just for him. And I am in awe. I am in awe of Jesus that he can even do any of this stuff. Because I don't know how to do any of it. And nobody in that village knew how to do any of it, and none of those disciples knew how to do any of it, and he just sets him free. And I don't know how you perceive of God, but he sees your chaos, and for most of us, it's thankfully less chaotic than that man. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Because y'all are clothed this morning, and I appreciate that. But he sees when people are in chaos, and he just rides the storm on in and brings peace. And it's such a beautiful thing. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus and his disciples, they're doing ministry. Luke chapter 7, they're doing ministry, and they come to another village, the village of Nain. And as they're walking into the village, and Jesus is kind of teaching, and the guys are along for the ride, and they come into the village, there's a funeral procession coming out of the village. And the polite thing then, as now, is to step aside and let the funeral procession go through. And Jesus so breaks the rules. I mean, this is profoundly culturally inappropriate. He walks up to the widow who's not burying her husband, but now burying her son, and says, "Don't weep." That's actually not the thing you usually say to, right? Who's been to a funeral? Do you walk up to the person who is most likely to need to weep and tell them not to weep? Like, it's so culturally inappropriate. Jesus, what are you doing? And he walks up to her and says, "Don't weep." And I think about that widow. Ladies, I know lots of you have jobs now, because that's a thing in this modern world, right? But in that day, this widow, there's no jobs for widows. Like, that's not a thing. Right? The family livelihood was largely driven by husband, and he's dead. And I imagine an incredibly reasonable response for the widow is that her hope for livelihood as her husband is dead shifts to her son. Everything about that's reasonable in that time, in that culture. And now her son's gone. She has no hope. She has no idea how she's going to eat. She has no idea how she's going to survive. She is in chaos. Absolute chaos. And then her funeral procession gets interrupted by this strange guy who tells her not to weep. It's the most normal response ever, Jesus. And then he puts his hand on the funeral bier and stops them. Whoa, dude. Not culturally appropriate. And then he looks at the dead man and he says, "Get up. Young man, get up." And he comes back to life. And the emotion of the room changed. It went from weeping and sadness to terrified. Immediately, everybody's like, is it a zombie? Is it a ghost? Is it some kind of ghoul? Like, what's going on here? And they're looking at the dead man who's now up, and they're looking at Jesus, and looking at the dead man, looking at Jesus, and nothing is making them feel more comfortable. And this sort of combination of terror and awe. What is going on that the dead are raised? And Jesus goes back to what he's doing. And I'm just like, he just like walks away and goes on his way. And I'm thinking, like, how long did they just stand there in the street and stare at each other? And then everybody's hugging everybody, and then there's just like beautiful chaos erupts. You know it does. And Jesus goes on his way. And he gets a little further into town. And two disciples from John the Baptist show up. This is starting at verse 18. I'm literally the next verse after the story. And these two disciples of John show up. Now, John's in jail. This is John the Baptist John. He's kind of famous. You've heard of him. John the Baptist is in jail. And if you've read the rest of the story, you know he's not getting out alive. And he sends two of John's followers to Jesus with the question, "Are you the one? Are you he who is to come, or should we look for somebody else? Like, are you the guy?" And they ask that question, and Jesus is like, "Hang on, I'm kind of busy giving this blind guy some sight, cleansing the leprosy off of this guy. He's got this skin disease. There's another dead guy. Let's bring his back to dead. And the poor are getting good news." Like, he's just going to town in ministry. And it's just stuff is happening. And it is ridiculous how much stuff is happening. And he looks at John's disciples and goes, "Why don't you tell him what you just saw? Why don't you tell him what you just saw? Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who's not offended by me." And John learns this news in jail, where he remains. I'm offended for John. Like, I know blessed is John if he's not offended by this, but literally, Jesus, you could get him out of jail. There's a half dozen examples of the skill in the book of Acts. Like, I've read some of this. I know you could get him out of jail. And he doesn't. But he gives him a smile on his face. Right? Because John believed, has prophesied, he's watching, he's like, is this it? And he's sitting in jail, and the word comes back, this is what we saw. And John goes, I thought it was him. The Messiah is here. I got to see him. And the poor have good news, and the lame walk. And John sits there and just cries a little happy cry because he saw him. And John's still in jail, but his chaos is gone. His chaos is gone. And it's hard to imagine sitting in jail with any kind of smile on your face, but I feel certain that John got this news. And he's like, I thought it was him. I knew. Tell me more. Did you see the blind guy? Did his eyes change? Like, how did you, like, I just imagine John just sort of grilling them. Tell me the stories of the God who comes in and delivers.
Hallelujah.
Because he does. Because he does. Because he does. Jesus invites John to believe while in jail. It's not the invitation that you might ask for, but I just know, I know that though his circumstance didn't change, his chaos was gone. For the widow, her circumstance changed. Like, her son's alive now. That's a big change. So her chaos is gone, and the circumstances, everything's different. Because they had an encounter with the Lord. A couple of weeks ago, we were finishing up our study of the book of James. And we high-fived Elijah for being that righteous man of faith whose prayer can change weather patterns for 3.5 years. And we really kind of looked at the story of Elijah, and we're like, woohoo! Go Elijah! James didn't mention chapter 19. Like, he went with the 17-18 victory, which is a good choice, honestly. We're going to look at 19 today. So, in 1 Kings 19, this is like the morning after he has literally called fire down from heaven and consumed the altar sacrifice and evaporated all the water and burned this. This massive fire comes down from heaven because he prayed. That's cool. And then he's like, hey, king, it's going to rain. Better get home. You're going to get wet. And he prays. And he prays and he prays 6, 7 times, but he prays, and the first rain in 3.5 years rolls in, and it is a gully washer of a rain. Did y'all say that phrase up here?
Oh, yeah.
But you understand it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Big rain. Okay. So every now and then, you know, you live in Georgia long enough, you pick up things. All right. I can't imagine a bigger series of victories that you and God are tight. God hears your prayers, responds to your requests, like you are crushing it as we come to the close of chapter 18. Like, high five, Elijah. 19 shows up, and the queen, she's famous, her name's Jezebel, you've heard of her. The queen is mad because all of her little pet prophets got killed in the process. And she swears an oath, may the gods do more to me if Elijah's not dead by tomorrow. I'm like, there's 950 of them dead, so you're going to get killed more than 950 times? Like, what are you even asking? He's like, wow, she really means this oath. May the gods kill me if I don't kill Elijah. And Elijah gets word of this, and he immediately stands up in faith as one who just called fire down from heaven. No, he immediately runs for his life terrified. Which is like such a human response. Because like the queen's got power and she's got guards and like you're just a guy. Like you, like run, buddy. What if God won't hear your prayers and doesn't help people? Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we forget the victories of yesterday. Sometimes we forget. And we run. In our fear and in our flesh, and we run. And so he runs, and he just runs as far as he can. He gets tired. He lays down under a tree, and he just collapses. And an angel wakes him up. He's like, hey, you should eat something. And he's like, oh, there's food. And he eats, and he falls back to sleep. And the angel wakes him up the second time. He's like, you should eat something. And he eats something, and he falls asleep. And he wakes up, and the angel's like, you got a ways to go, so get on. As an aside, this sermon is all about God and encountering God and God's ability to still your chaos. Like please hear me, that is the goal of today if ever I had one. But sometimes you need a meal and a nap and it'll help your chaos. Like just as an aside, right? You're playing football like Betty White and you need a Snickers bar. Like just sometimes you need a meal and a nap. And likely those closest to you recognize the symptoms, and when they tell you you need a meal and a nap, they're not wrong. Are you hydrated? Just as an aside, that does play into your ability to be strong in life. So like don't forget to manage yourself, okay? But meanwhile, back over here at Jesus. So he gets this food and he runs 40 days and 40 nights in the strength of that food. I want some of those cakes. And he goes to the mountain of God. Remember the one Moses went up on top of? He goes to the mountain of God. And there's a cave. And he goes up in the cave. And he's exhausted. As a young man, I always imagined God to be one who would scold. Probably because I received a few scoldings in my day. And there's a risk that we will assume that what we've experienced is actually always full truth and is a good reflection of how God is, because there's a risk there, right? And I want to show you. God shows up and says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he doesn't go, Elijah, dude. Didn't we do this, and didn't we do this, and didn't we do this, and why are you failing, and dude, come on, he doesn't, pull your act together, you didn't do any of that. What are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? We were doing work back in town, why'd you run away? And Elijah, jumps into his prepared speech. Well, I am very zealous for the Lord, and I have been doing these things, but they've killed all the prophets, and now they're threatening to kill me, and I'm all alone, and woe is me, and just launches into his little speech. And God doesn't correct any of it. He just goes, hey, I'm going to swing by in a second. Let's have a conversation. If you've not read 1 Kings 19, you're going to want to go look at this. God just says, I'm going to swing by. And immediately, there's this wind. And he hears the wind, and it is like crazy, scary wind, knocking rocks and trees over, like whoosh, wind. And God wasn't in the wind. And then there's an earthquake. I don't think I would want to be in the cave any longer at this point. There's just this part of my brain that was like, cave and earthquake sounds like a bad idea. But there's this earthquake. The whole mountain is shaking while he's in it. But God wasn't in the earthquake. And then there's a fire, and I have no idea where this fire came from. But it just engulfs the mountain. I told you there was a wind. I swear I didn't touch it.
Yeah.
All right. God's not fire either. And then there's a sound. Or maybe it's an absence of sound. Depending on the Bible translation that you look at, I've seen this described as a still small voice. I've seen translations that translated a sound of sheer silence. And it's clear to me that like the translators are like, this is kind of mysterious. And they're trying to make sense of it in a new language. But there is this sound. And Elijah knows. He's here. And he covers his face because he knows he's about to walk into the presence of the God who can shake mountains and call fire down from heaven. And like he knows he's heading into the presence of the holy. And he's terrified. And he covers his head and he walks out. And God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, well, I was zealous about following you and they killed everybody and I'm all alone and I'm scared. And he has this encounter with God. And he says, you're not alone. Actually, I have these other people I've been taking care of too. And you're not alone because I'm with you. And I've got work for you to still do. And so would you go to this town and do this, and would you go to this town and do this, and would you go to this town and this, and I've got this guy who's going to be your apprentice. And he just accepts him in his fragility. He's just human. And he got scared, and he ran for his life, and God's like, I got work for you to do still. And they have this encounter, and he goes in the strength of that encounter, and he faces his fears, and he goes back. There is nothing on this planet like an encounter with God. There is nothing like an encounter with God. Back in January, the elder couples, we all got together to kind of fast and pray. Lord, what are you doing? What are you saying? What are you revealing? And this is one of the words that came up. We need encounters.
Hallelujah.
And we looked at kind of what's the ministry that we're doing and what does God want us to focus on and what can we be about as leaders. We're praying into that. God, what are you doing? And how do we agree with you and not resist you? Like, how do we get on board? And it was like, we need God to break in. And we need God to show up. And we need that more than we need random ministry thing. And that word just resonated with us. And we have been praying into that. Oh God, we need more of that. Would you break in? Would you allow us to encounter you? Would you allow people to bump into you in this place? And it shifted how we were praying, and it shifted how we were thinking about some of the ministry that we're doing, because we realized it's like, honestly, if we could just get people to Jesus, and they could have an encounter with him, probably a lot of stuff would work itself out. Because he rides chaos like it's a pony. Stuff that's bigger than us. Stuff that scares us. Stuff that we don't know how to deal with. Stuff that's beyond our ability, that's beyond our wisdom. He just rides it like it's a pony. In a petting zoo. So that's what we've been praying for months now. God, would you give us more of those? moments that we can be face to face with you. And it may well be that we get close and we sense it. We're just, okay, this is scary. Because it is, because he's God. This is terrifying. And it's the most peace-giving thing on the planet. I don't know how that works together. But I want it again. If I could have it daily, that'd be great. Every time I'm reading in like a Matthew 5, blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's like, what about those that hunger and thirst for encounter? How do you feel about them? Because I do. Because when he shows up, peace shows up in my world. And sometimes he shows up and he deals with my circumstances. And sometimes he shows up and I just sit and smile in jail because I know he's there. And I don't know when was the last time you got to encounter him, but that is our deepest prayer for you, church. Is that in the midst of your chaos, you'll find him.
Yes.
And he'll calm the storm. And he'll certainly calm the sailor. So I'm going to ask God to show up here right now. I'm just going to pray a little bit. Some of you came hungry for him already, so if I could just step out of the way, you'll probably get there. And for others, I'm going to just encourage you, press in.